The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Henry Anderson's photography studio in Dodge City, the glass plates and chemicals arranged meticulously on wooden shelves that lined the walls. His calloused hands, stained permanently brown from silver nitrate, carefully polished the brass lens of his prized camera. Through the dusty window, he watched cattle drives move past, the rhythmic sound of hooves on packed earth a constant backdrop to life in this bustling frontier town of 1876. Unlike the cowboys and cattle barons who'd made their fortunes in beef, Henry had carved out an unusual niche capturing the changing face of the American West. His walls displayed haunting portraits of weather-beaten ranchers, proud Native American chiefs, and the last of the great buffalo herds. But it was his lesser-known work, detailed photographs of ancient rock art and Pueblo ruins, that truly stirred his soul. The bell above his door chimed as Daniel Clark burst in, his ranch foreman's vest covered in trail dust. "Henry, you need to come quick," he said between heavy breaths. "Found something strange out by Snake Creek. Some kind of old pictures painted on the rocks, but there's trouble brewing. Army patrol's got a Comanche man cornered there. They're saying he's a spy, but he looks more like some kind of holy man." Henry's heart quickened at the mention of rock art. He'd spent years documenting such sites, building relationships with tribal elders who sometimes shared fragments of their sacred knowledge. Without hesitation, he packed his camera and glass plates into leather cases, along with a Winchester rifle. The West might be changing, but it wasn't yet tame enough to travel unarmed. The ride to Snake Creek took nearly 2 hours, their horses picking their way through the rolling prairie that surrounded Dodge City. Daniel led them past massive herds of Taylor Ranch cattle, the animals raising their heads briefly as the riders passed. The late summer grass was beginning to yellow, and dust devils danced across the plain like restless spirits. They heard the confrontation before they saw it. Angry voices echoed off the creek's limestone walls, where a small group of soldiers had a lone figure backed against the rock face. The man wore traditional Comanche clothing, his silver-streaked hair bound with a leather band. Despite being surrounded, he stood with quiet dignity, one hand pressed against the ancient pictographs that covered the rock behind him. Captain Frank Moore of the 6th Cavalry Regiment had his pistol drawn, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Last chance, old man. Either you start talking English and explain what you're doing this far north, or we'll let the fort commander sort it out." The other soldiers shifted nervously, their rifles at the ready. Henry recognized the captain's reputation for harsh treatment of natives who strayed from their designated territories. "Gentlemen," Henry called out, as he dismounted, trying to project calm authority, "I believe I can be of assistance. I've worked as a translator with the Comanche before." This wasn't entirely true, but he had picked up enough of their language to manage basic communication. The captain's head snapped around, clearly annoyed at the interruption, the Comanche elder's dark eyes fixed on Henry, showing neither fear nor hope. Behind him, the rock art depicted intricate scenes, hunters, spirit beings, and what appeared to be a map-like arrangement of symbols. Henry's photographer's eye immediately recognized this was no ordinary sight. The patterns were unlike anything he'd documented before. "This is military business, Anderson," Captain Moore growled. "Unless you're here to photograph these savages being brought to justice, I suggest you ride on." But Henry stood his ground, hands raised in a peaceful gesture. He'd seen too many sacred sites destroyed, too many elders silenced. Something about this particular moment felt pivotal, as if the very fate of the West's hidden history hung in the balance. Henry took a calculated step forward, the dry grass crunching beneath his boots. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rock face, making the pictographs seem to dance with an otherworldly energy. He could feel the weight of his camera equipment in his satchel, but right now, documentation was secondary to preventing bloodshed. "Captain Moore, these markings could be vital intelligence," Henry said, choosing his words carefully. "If we destroy them or eliminate their interpreter, we lose any chance of understanding what they mean. The Army's been looking for the Comanche winter camps. This could be the key." He saw a flicker of interest cross the captain's weathered face. The elder, who had remained silent, spoke softly in Comanche. Henry caught fragments about sacred places and ancient ones, but the rest was beyond his limited grasp of the language. What struck him was the deliberate way the old man's eyes kept returning to one particular section of the rock art, a series of spiraling symbols that seemed to point toward distant mountains. 2 days, Henry proposed, wiping sweat from his brow. "Give me 2 days with him at my camp near Dodge City. If there's nothing of military value, you can proceed as you see fit." The last words tasted bitter in his mouth, but he knew they were necessary. Behind the captain, two young soldiers shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsettled by the prospect of executing an elderly man. Captain Moore ran a gloved hand along his mustache, considering. The plains stretched endlessly around them, the afternoon heat creating shimmering mirages on the horizon. A lone hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the tense silence. Finally, the captain nodded curtly. 2 days, Anderson. But I'm leaving Frank here to keep watch. Any trouble, and I'll have both your heads." The young soldier named Frank dismounted, leading his horse toward Henry's position. He looked barely 20, with kind eyes that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. The rest of the patrol wheeled their horses around, hooves thundering against the sun-baked earth as they rode toward their garrison outside Cheyenne. As the dust settled, Henry approached the elder slowly, hands visible. "I am Henry," he said in halting Comanche, then switched to English, hoping the old man understood some of it. "I wish to learn. To protect." He gestured at the rock art, then at his camera. The elder's face remained impassive, but he inclined his head slightly, acknowledgement, if not quite trust. Frank helped Henry set up a temporary camp as the sun began its descent, the prairie grass turning golden in the fading light. The elder, who eventually revealed his name as Making Marks, accepted their offer of coffee but refused other provisions. He sat cross-legged, facing the rock art wall, occasionally murmuring what seemed like prayers. That night, under a vast canopy of stars, Henry couldn't sleep. The gentle rustle of prairie wind through the grass carried whispers of ancient secrets. He caught Making Marks, studying him in the firelight, measuring his worth with eyes that had seen nearly a century of change sweep across these lands. Tomorrow, Henry knew, would begin a journey that would force him to choose between two worlds. And he wasn't entirely sure he was ready for what either choice would mean. Frank kept his distance, more interested in tending to his horse than participating in what he clearly viewed as a futile exercise. But Henry noticed how the young soldier's gaze frequently returned to the rock art, curiosity warring with his military discipline. As the night deepened, the three men formed an uneasy triangle around the dying fire, each lost in thoughts of what the coming days might bring. Before sleep finally claimed him, Henry made out Making Mark's silhouette against the star-filled sky, arms raised in what appeared to be blessing or supplication. The old man's whispered words carried on the wind. The ancestors watch. The canyon waits. The choice comes with the dawn. Henry understood enough to know that his life was about to change forever, but not enough to know if that change would bring salvation or destruction. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, finding Henry already awake and studying the pictographs with renewed intensity. His camera equipment lay carefully arranged beside him, each glass plate nested in its protective wrapping. The morning air carried the crisp bite of early autumn, and in the distance, cattle lowed as ranch hands began their day's work on the surrounding plains. Making Marks emerged from his blankets like a spirit materializing from the morning mist, his weathered face bearing none of the previous night's weariness. He moved to Henry's side with deliberate steps, reaching into the folds of his clothing to withdraw a leather pouch worn smooth by decades of handling. Frank stirred nearby, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle before recognizing the familiar figures. "The sun rises twice before we reach the canyon's mouth," Making Marks said in halting English, carefully emptying the pouch's contents onto a clean cloth. What spilled forth made Henry's breath catch. Fragments of pottery decorated with symbols matching those on the rock face, and most intriguingly, a piece of hide marked with what appeared to be a crude map. Frank abandoned any pretense of sleep, moving closer despite his previous skepticism. The young soldier's face betrayed a mix of professional suspicion and personal fascination as Making Marks began arranging the artifacts in a pattern that seemed to mirror the constellation Orion. Henry's photographer's eye couldn't help but notice how the morning light caught the ancient pottery shards, creating shadows that seemed to point toward the distant hills. "My people have guarded these secrets since before the white man's horses reached our lands," Making Marks continued, his fingers tracing lines between the artifacts. "But the soldiers who hunt us grow bold. They will find the canyon soon, with or without our help. Better it should be found by one who sees with respect than those who see only gold." his eyes fixed on Henry with an intensity that made the photographer shift uncomfortably. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of hoofbeats. Henry Anderson squinted through his camera's viewfinder at the distant herd of buffalo, their dark shapes stark against the golden prairie grass. As a frontier photographer documenting the vanishing West for Eastern newspapers, he'd seen his share of magnificent sights, but something about this September evening felt different. The light had an otherworldly quality, casting long shadows across the Kansas plains near Dodge City, where he'd established his temporary camp. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the silence. Henry's head snapped up as he spotted a group of soldiers pursuing a lone figure on horseback. The rider's long black hair and traditional dress marked him as Comanche, though he carried no weapons. Henry watched in horror as the soldiers fired again, their bullets kicking up dust around the fleeing man. Without thinking, Henry grabbed his own rifle and fired 3 quick shots into the air, causing the soldiers to rein up in confusion. "Over here!" Henry shouted, waving his arms. "U.S. Marshals photographer, stand down." It was a lie, but one that bought precious seconds as the Comanche rider veered toward him. The soldiers hesitated, clearly unsure about confronting a supposed federal agent. By the time they realized the deception, the Comanche had reached Henry's camp, dismounting smoothly despite a bleeding wound in his shoulder. The soldiers' leader, a hard-faced sergeant named Frank Moore, rode up with his men close behind. "That Indian's a spy," he barked. "Been seen near the fort too many times. Hand him over." Henry stood his ground, mind racing. "He's my guide," he countered. "Hired him myself in Dodge City. I have papers." Another lie, but Henry's official-looking camera equipment and confident tone gave it weight. "I am no spy," the Comanche man said in clear English, his voice steady despite his injury. "I am Daniel Walker, educated at the mission school. I study the old ways, the stories of my people." He met the sergeant's suspicious glare without flinching. "This man speaks truth. I guide photographers and writers who wish to document our lands." The surname was obviously adopted, but Henry admired the quick thinking. Sergeant Moore's face darkened with barely contained rage. "You're interfering with military business, photographer. This won't be forgotten." He wheeled his horse around, gesturing for his men to follow. They rode off toward Dodge City, leaving behind unspoken threats that hung heavy in the evening air. Henry quickly helped Daniel into his tent to treat the wound, knowing this was far from over. As Henry cleaned and bandaged the injury, Daniel explained he was indeed a tribal storyteller, traveling to sacred sites to record ancient tales and symbols before they were lost forever. "The soldiers fear knowledge they cannot control," he said grimly. "They think I map their fort, but I seek something far older." From his satchel, he withdrew a bundle of leather wrapped around what appeared to be pieces of painted hide. Daniel's dark eyes studied Henry intently before he slowly unwrapped the bundle, revealing elaborate pictographs unlike anything Henry had seen before. "These tell of a hidden canyon city," Daniel said softly. "A place of great power and wealth, sacred to my people for generations. The soldiers hunt me because they suspect I know its location. They would destroy it seeking gold, as they have destroyed so much else." Henry's photographer's eye was drawn to the intricate symbols, spirals, geometric patterns, stylized animals, and human figures that seemed to dance across the ancient hide. He could sense there was indeed a map encoded in the images, though its meaning remained obscure. "Why show me this?" he asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Because you chose to help a stranger without asking his worth in gold first. And because you see with an artist's eye, you understand that some things hold value beyond mere metal." That night, as they sat beside the campfire, Daniel began teaching Henry to read the pictographs' deeper meanings. The photographer found himself drawn into a world of symbol and metaphor, where cardinal directions danced with animal spirits and the very landscape itself held secret messages. But a growing unease gnawed at him. If he helped find this hidden city, could he truly protect it from those who would plunder its riches? News traveled fast on the frontier. By morning, rumors were already circulating in Dodge City about the photographer who defied the military and harbored a suspected spy. Henry knew they had to move on quickly, but his own curiosity about the pictograph's secrets had taken hold. Daniel's wound needed time to heal, so they broke camp and headed south, away from the soldiers' usual patrol routes. The unlikely pair made their way across the vast prairie, stopping at remote ranches where Daniel's reputation as a storyteller earned them shelter. At each stop, Henry photographed the magnificent landscapes while Daniel slowly revealed more of the hidden city's story. The pictographs spoke of a place where ancient peoples had built dwellings high in red rock walls, leaving behind not just gold, but repositories of sacred knowledge. At the Clark family ranch, they found temporary refuge with the owner's daughter Rachel, who shared Daniel's passion for preserving native culture. She helped tend his healing wound while eagerly learning the stories he shared. Henry found himself drawn to her quiet strength and fierce intelligence, even as he worried their presence put her family at risk. The growing connection between them added another layer of complexity to his already conflicted feelings about the hidden city's fate. Their respite was shattered when Charlie Taylor, a local prospector, overheard Daniel telling traditional stories at the ranch. The man's eyes lit up with naked greed at mentions of ancient treasures. That evening, he rode for Dodge City, clearly intent on alerting Sergeant Moore. Henry and Daniel knew they had to leave immediately, though Rachel's tears at their hasty departure tore at Henry's heart. They fled south under cover of darkness, but now they had both soldiers and gold-hungry civilians on their trail. The pictograph's secret seemed to burn in Henry's saddlebags as they rode, their meaning slowly crystallizing in his mind. He realized he faced an impossible choice: help protect an irreplaceable piece of native heritage, or give in to the fortune that beckoned. Either way, he knew that decision would change not just his life, but the fate of something far larger than himself. As they made camp that night, Daniel spoke of how his people believed certain choices echo through generations, their consequences rippling out like stones dropped in still water. Henry stared into the fire, understanding now why the spirits had led him to this moment. The hidden city's location was becoming clear in his mind, but so too was the weight of responsibility that came with such knowledge. The morning brought an unsettling discovery: fresh hoofprints in the sandy soil around their camp. Henry and Daniel had been followed despite their careful efforts to cover their tracks. The photographer's trained eye noticed details others might miss: the distinctive mark of military horseshoes among the tracks. His heart sank, knowing that Frank's cavalry unit must be closing in. Daniel studied the tracks with equal concern, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he traced patterns in the dirt with a practiced finger. "They split into two groups," he said softly. "One follows the creek east toward Cheyenne, the other circles south. They try to trap us between." The old storyteller's calm assessment belied the gravity of their situation. The vast prairie stretched before them like an ocean of grass, offering both possibility and peril. Henry knew the open plains left them exposed, but the alternative, trying to lose their pursuers in the rocky foothills, would slow them down too much. He pulled out his maps, spreading them carefully across his saddle as the morning wind tugged at the corners. "There's a ranch belonging to Martha Winston about 20 miles south," Henry said, pointing to a penciled notation. "She's no friend to the military after they requisitioned her cattle during the last campaign. We might find shelter there, at least for a day." Daniel nodded slowly, though his eyes remained fixed on the distant horizon where dust devils danced across the prairie. As they rode, Henry found his thoughts returning to Rachel and the life he'd left behind in Dodge City. The comfortable routine of his photography studio seemed like a dream now, replaced by this desperate flight across the plains. But when he looked at the ancient pictographs, carefully wrapped in oilcloth in his saddlebag, he knew he couldn't have chosen differently. Daniel rode beside him in silence for several miles before speaking. "The city you seek was not built by my people," he said finally. "It is older than the oldest stories. My grandfather's grandfather spoke of it as ancient even then. Some say it holds powerful medicine, others that it guards the entrance to the spirit world itself." His words carried on the wind, heavy with meaning. The sun climbed higher as they pushed their horses harder than they would have liked. Henry spotted more dust on the horizon, riders moving fast, though still too far to identify. They veered west, using a line of cottonwoods along a dry creek bed for cover. The trees' shadows offered brief respite from the punishing summer heat. By mid-afternoon, they caught sight of Martha Winston's ranch house shimmering in the distance like a mirage. The sturdy log structure sat amid a cluster of outbuildings, with cattle grazing in the surrounding pastures. Henry had photographed the ranch last spring, capturing the stark beauty of the place for Martha's eastern relatives. As they approached, Henry saw Martha herself striding out to meet them, rifle cradled easily in her arms. Her gray hair was tied back severely, and her face showed the leather-tough resilience of a woman who'd carved out her own place on the frontier. She recognized Henry immediately, though her expression remained guarded as she evaluated Daniel. "I know that look," she said, lowering her rifle slightly. "You boys are running from something." It wasn't a question. Henry dismounted slowly, his joints stiff from hours in the saddle. He knew Martha's help could mean the difference between escape and capture, but sharing too much could put her at risk as well. Before Henry could respond, Daniel spoke with quiet dignity. "We seek only to protect what belongs to the spirits," he said. "Those who follow us would take it by force." Martha's eyes narrowed as she studied the old storyteller, some unspoken understanding passing between them. After a long moment, she nodded toward the barn. "Get your horses out of sight," she said. "I'll have Laura bring you some food. But understand this. If trouble comes calling, I expect the truth before I decide which side I'm on." Henry led the horses toward the barn, relief mingling with anxiety. They had found temporary sanctuary, but he knew their pursuers wouldn't be far behind. The weight of the pictographs seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Inside the barn's cool shadows, Henry and Daniel exchanged knowing looks. They had bought themselves some time, but the real journey, and the impossible choice it would force, still lay ahead. The hidden city waited somewhere in the vast landscape, its ancient secrets both a promise and a burden that would shape not just their fate, but perhaps the future of two peoples. The scorching afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Comanche camp as Henry Anderson clutched the weathered leather map to his chest, his photographer's hands trembling. Before him stood Charlie Walker, the cavalry sergeant who had pursued him relentlessly since El Paso, flanked by a dozen mounted soldiers with rifles trained on the collection of teepees. The sacred pictographs that old Running Bear had entrusted to Henry seemed to burn against his skin, their ancient secrets threatening to tear the world apart. Robert Clark, the ruthless cattle baron who had initially hired Henry to document his expanding ranch empire, sat atop his stallion at Charlie's side. His usual businessman's smile had twisted into something darker as he gestured toward the leather pouch. "The photographs and the map, Anderson. Now those Indian drawings aren't worth dying over." But Henry knew they were worth far more than his life. They were the key to the legendary Canyon of Whispers, said to hold riches beyond imagination. Margaret Taylor, the Comanche translator who had helped Henry understand Running Bear's final words, stepped forward despite the rifles tracking her movement. Her dark eyes met Henry's with fierce intensity. "You gave your word," she said softly in English, though her voice carried across the tense silence. "The sacred places must remain hidden." Henry nodded almost imperceptibly, remembering the trust in the old storyteller's eyes as he passed on his people's secrets. The past 3 months flashed through Henry's mind, documenting Robert's growing ranching empire around Dodge City, meeting Margaret as she worked to preserve her people's stories, discovering Running Bear's incredible knowledge of the ancient Canyon City. The old man had recognized something in Henry, some quality that made him choose to share the sacred maps rather than let them die with him when the soldiers came. Now that trust would be tested. Frank Moore, Henry's assistant who had helped develop the photographs that first revealed the hidden symbols in Running Bear's drawings, shifted nervously beside the camera wagon. His fingers inched toward the rifle stored beneath the seat, but Henry subtly shook his head. Violence would only lead to bloodshed, and the soldiers would claim the maps either way. There had to be another solution. "Last chance, Anderson," Robert called out, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Those drawings are worthless except to lead us to the gold. Think about your future. I'm offering you a full partnership in whatever we find. 20% of a fortune beats dying in the dirt with these savages." Several of the Comanche warriors tensed at his words, but Margaret's raised hand kept them still. Henry's mind raced through possibilities as he watched the sun sink lower on the horizon. The canyon itself was less than a day's ride away, its location now burned into his memory after studying the pictographs countless times. But its contents were far more than mere gold. The ancient city held irreplaceable artifacts, sacred spaces that had remained untouched for centuries. Running Bear had made him understand that some treasures were beyond price. With deliberate slowness, Henry reached into his vest and withdrew a stack of photographs, the ones showing Robert's men rustling cattle from neighboring ranches, proof of the empire's criminal foundations. Here's what's going to happen, he said clearly, holding up the damning evidence. You're going to turn around and ride away, or these photographs will find their way to every marshal and newspaper from here to Cheyenne. Robert's face darkened with rage, but Charlie Walker surprised everyone by laughing. He's got you there, Mr. Clark. Even if we shot them all, those photographs would still surface. My men signed on to protect settlers, not murder innocents to hide your crimes. The sergeant turned to his troops. Stand down, boys. We're leaving. Robert spluttered in protest, but the soldiers were already lowering their weapons. As the dust settled from the departing cavalry, Margaret approached Henry with tears in her eyes. You could have traded the maps for your life. Why didn't you? Henry carefully folded the sacred pictographs and handed them back to her. Because some things are worth more than gold, he replied softly. Running Bear trusted me to protect his people's heritage. I couldn't betray that. The Comanche camp burst into activity as families began packing to move to safer grounds. But Margaret lingered. The canyon doesn't just hold sacred relics, she said hesitantly. There's something else Running Bear wanted you to find. Something he said would change how people see his people's history. Would you help me look for it? Henry smiled, already knowing his answer. Some treasures weren't meant to be buried forever. Frank appeared beside them, grinning as he loaded the camera equipment. Well, I suppose this means we're not retiring rich after all. Henry clapped his friend's shoulder. Maybe not with gold, Frank, but I think we're about to discover something far more valuable. As the sun set behind the endless prairie, Henry felt a profound sense of rightness. Sometimes the greatest wealth came from protecting what was priceless. The canyon's ancient walls loomed before them as Henry, Margaret, and Frank picked their way carefully down the narrow trail. The morning sun cast long shadows across weathered pictographs that seemed to glow with an inner light. Henry's camera equipment bounced against his back, while Margaret traced her fingers reverently along the stone markings, translating the sacred symbols her people had preserved for generations. There, she whispered, pointing to a series of interconnected spirals. Running Bear said the truth lies behind the 7 circles. Frank examined the wall skeptically, while Henry studied the formation through his viewfinder, noting how the shadows created depth that wasn't immediately visible to the naked eye. Suddenly, the sound of horses echoed through the canyon. Daniel appeared at the rim above, leading a group of armed men. Found you at last, Henry, he called down. Now step aside and let us claim what's rightfully ours. That gold belongs to civilization, not gathering dust in some Indian graveyard. Henry positioned himself between the wall and Daniel's men, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. This place holds something far more precious than gold, Daniel. These pictographs tell the true story of the Comanche people, their knowledge, their wisdom, their connection to this land. I won't let you destroy that. Margaret worked quickly behind him, her fingers finding hidden catches in the rock face as Frank kept watch. The canyon walls seemed to whisper with centuries of stories as Daniel and his men began descending the trail, rifles glinting in the morning light. Last chance, Henry, Daniel warned. Don't be a fool. Think of what you could do with your share. Build that fancy photography studio you always wanted in Dodge City. Leave this wasteland behind. But Henry stood his ground, remembering Running Bear's trust in him and the weight of that responsibility. Just then, Margaret gave a soft cry of triumph. A section of the wall swung silently inward, revealing a hidden chamber. Inside, protected from the elements for hundreds of years, lay bundles of preserved deerskin maps and delicate woven tapestries depicting the Comanche people's journey through time. This is what Running Bear meant, Margaret breathed, carefully gathering the precious artifacts. Not gold or jewels, but our people's true history. Proof that we were more than the savages they painted us to be. These show our astronomy, our medicine, our understanding of the natural world. Daniel's men had nearly reached them when a horn sounded from above. The canyon filled with mounted Comanche warriors, led by Margaret's brother Robert. Their presence a silent reminder that some treasures had guardians more determined than any greed. Daniel hesitated, calculating the odds, then slowly lowered his rifle. This isn't over, he growled, but Henry could see the defeat in his eyes. As Daniel's group retreated, Frank let out a long breath. That was too close, but worth it, I'd say. Henry carefully set up his camera, documenting each precious artifact as Margaret and Robert explained their significance. These images would tell a different story than the dime novels and yellow journalism, a story of dignity, wisdom, and endurance that deserved to be preserved. As the day drew to a close, Margaret approached Henry with a small bundle. "Running Bear wanted you to have this," she said softly. "It's a map showing other sacred sites that need protection. He knew you would understand their true value." Henry accepted the gift with humbled gratitude, knowing his life's work had just begun. Under the vast prairie sky, Henry packed away his camera while Frank prepared their horses for the ride to Cheyenne, where the first exhibitions of Henry's photographs would help change hearts and minds. The real treasure, he realized, wasn't what they had found in the canyon, but what they would share with the world. A legacy of truth that would endure long after gold had lost its luster. The setting sun painted the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose, the ancient pictographs seeming to dance in the fading light. Henry took one last photograph, capturing not just the rocks and shadows, but the spirit of a people who had entrusted him with their story. Some choices defined a man's character forever, and he knew he had made the right one. The ancient canyon walls loomed before Henry Anderson as he guided his horse along the narrow trail, the precious bundle of pictographs secured in his saddlebag, weighing heavily on his conscience. Behind him, Charlie Moore, the Comanche storyteller who had entrusted him with the sacred maps, rode in silence. The setting sun painted the towering rock faces in brilliant shades of amber and crimson, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Henry's heart as he contemplated the choice that lay ahead. Margaret Taylor's warning echoed in his mind. As the curator of Dodge City's small museum, she had been the first to recognize the historical significance of the pictographs. "These aren't just treasure maps, Henry," she had told him. "They're the last remaining record of a civilization that vanished centuries ago. What you choose to do with them will echo through generations." The camp they established beneath a towering cottonwood tree was simple: 2 bedrolls, a small fire, and the constant whisper of prairie grass in the wind. Charlie sat cross-legged near the flames, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering light as he spoke of his people's connection to the hidden canyon city. His words painted vivid images of a place where ancient wisdom and untold riches lay intertwined, waiting to be either preserved or plundered. Frank Clark's cattle empire stretched across the surrounding plains, his ambitious plans for expansion threatening both the sacred sites and the remaining Comanche lands. Henry had witnessed the rancher's ruthlessness firsthand when he'd photographed the aftermath of raids on Native American camps, raids that bore the unmistakable signature of Clark's hired guns, though nothing could ever be proven. The sound of approaching horses broke the pre-dawn stillness. Henry's hand instinctively moved to his rifle as Robert Walker, Clark's lead enforcer, emerged from the shadows with 3 armed men. "Word travels fast about treasure," Walker drawled, his cold eyes fixed on the saddlebag containing the pictographs. "Mr. Clark sends his regards and an offer to make this easy." Charlie's quiet voice carried across the camp with unexpected authority. "The spirits of my ancestors guard what lies hidden in the canyon. They have watched and waited, knowing this day would come when the path of greed would cross the path of wisdom. The choice was always meant to be yours, Henry Anderson." In that moment, Henry saw with crystal clarity the photographs he'd taken over the years. The faces of displaced tribes, the destruction of sacred grounds, the steady erasure of a culture that had lived in harmony with these lands for countless generations. The weight of the pictographs seemed to grow heavier still, but his resolve strengthened. "Your Mr. Clark can keep his offer," Henry said, rising slowly to face Walker. "These maps don't lead to the kind of treasure he understands." His fingers wrapped around something in his pocket, the small brass key to the Dodge City Museum's archive room, where Margaret had promised to protect and preserve any artifacts they discovered. Walker's men spread out, weapons ready, but it was Charlie who moved first. With a speed that belied his years, he threw a handful of powder into the fire. The flames erupted in a brilliant flash of blue-green light, temporarily blinding their would-be attackers. In the confusion, Henry and Charlie mounted their horses and galloped into the darkness. The chase that followed became legend in those parts. 2 men outmaneuvering a gang of hired guns through treacherous canyon country, guided by ancient knowledge and desperate determination. They rode through the night, using trails that hadn't seen human traffic in generations, trails marked in the pictographs that had been entrusted to Henry's care. Dawn found them at the hidden entrance to the canyon city, exactly where the maps had indicated. The rising sun revealed towering cliff dwellings, their windows like countless eyes gazing out across time. Henry raised his camera, knowing these would be the only photographs ever taken of this sacred place. Images that would be sealed away in the museum's archives, protected from those who would exploit them. As Charlie led a prayer of gratitude to his ancestors, Henry developed a new appreciation for the true meaning of wealth. The real treasure wasn't gold or silver, but the preservation of something far more precious. The living memory of a people who had called this land home long before others arrived to claim it. The story of Henry Anderson's choice spread through the territory, whispered around campfires and retold in saloons. Frank Clark's empire eventually crumbled, undone by his obsession with finding the Canyon City's riches. The pictographs remained safely preserved in Margaret Taylor's museum, their secrets protected for future generations who might better understand their true value. Years later, Henry would sometimes visit the museum, watching as Charlie Moore taught young Comanche children about their heritage using the photographs Henry had taken. The ancient Canyon City remained untouched, its location known only to those who had earned the right to serve as its guardians. And in the end, that was the greatest treasure of all. The knowledge that some things are worth more than gold, and some choices echo through time like thunder across the prairie. The changing seasons brought new life to the prairie, and with it came unexpected developments. Henry's photography studio in Dodge City flourished as more settlers arrived, seeking to document their lives on the frontier. But his most meaningful work remained the careful documentation of Comanche cultural sites and ceremonies, always done with Charlie Moore's guidance and blessing. The two men had forged a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding, bridging worlds that others thought forever divided. Margaret Taylor's museum in Cheyenne grew into a respected institution, drawing visitors from as far as Boston and Philadelphia who came to study the carefully preserved artifacts and photographs. She had created something unprecedented, a place where Native American history was treated with reverence rather than relegated to curiosity cabinets. The pictographs Henry had entrusted to her care became the cornerstone of an extensive collection that told the true story of the Plains peoples. Frank Clark's decline proved swift and devastating. His obsession with finding the Canyon City drove him to squander his fortune on failed expeditions and unreliable guides. When his cattle empire finally collapsed, he was found one winter morning in his Deadwood office, empty whiskey bottles scattered around his desk, and a worn copy of Henry's photographs clutched in his frozen hands. His pursuit of material wealth had led only to ruin, a harsh lesson that resonated throughout the territory. The Comanche people faced their own struggles as reservation life threatened their traditional ways. But Charlie Moore worked tirelessly to preserve their stories and customs, using Henry's photographs as teaching tools. Young tribal members would gather in Margaret's museum, listening intently as Charlie explained the significance of each image, each sacred site, each ceremony captured through Henry's lens. It was a way of keeping their heritage alive, even as the world around them transformed. Susan, Henry's wife, had supported his choice from the beginning. She understood that her husband's decision to protect the Canyon City had been about more than just resisting temptation. It was about recognizing the deeper values that money couldn't buy. Together, they built a life focused on documenting and preserving the vanishing frontier, their camera lens capturing both the beauty and the tragedy of a changing West. The mystery of the Canyon City continued to draw treasure seekers, but its location remained secure. Those who knew its whereabouts, Henry, Charlie, and a select few tribal elders, maintained their silence. The site became something of a legend, whispered about in trail camps and trading posts. But unlike other frontier tales, this one served as a reminder that some treasures were meant to remain untouched, their value lying not in gold or silver, but in the stories they held. Years passed, and Henry's photographs gained recognition beyond the territory. Museums in New York and Washington expressed interest in his collection, but he insisted that the images remain in the West, close to the people and places they depicted. His studio became a gathering place for those seeking to understand the true history of the frontier, where cowboys and Native Americans alike would stop to share their stories and have their portraits made. Charlie Moore's influence grew as well. He became a respected voice for his people, traveling between reservations and settlements, using the photographs and pictographs to educate both Native and white children about the importance of preserving cultural heritage. The partnership he and Henry had formed became a model for others, proving that understanding and respect could overcome the prejudices of the past. As Henry grew older, he often reflected on that fateful decision in the canyon. The wealth he might have claimed seemed insignificant compared to the legacy he had helped create. A visual history that would endure long after the last cattle drive, the last gold rush, the last frontier town had faded into memory. In choosing to protect the sacred rather than exploit it, he had discovered a different kind of richness, one measured not in dollars but in the preservation of something precious and irreplaceable. The prairie winds still carried the echoes of ancient stories, and now those stories had new guardians. Henry's photographs, Margaret's museum, Charlie's teachings. Together they formed a bridge between worlds, ensuring that future generations would understand the true value of the treasures they had chosen to protect. And somewhere, hidden in the vastness of the western landscape, the canyon city remained untouched, its secrets safe with those who understood that some things were worth far more than gold.